Okay, so we're going to talk about free will. And I know I've told the story before that there's some things I paid to go to seminary to learn. And it was all the big questions about, and free will was one of them. How do you understand what free will is? How do you understand what it means in the context of being a sinner? And it's a tough question. You'll see the question, is there such a thing as free will? Does it exist even? And how many of you, who have any Rush fans out in the audience? It's been years. Yeah, the drummer just passed away, I think it was last year, Neil Peart. They had a song called Free Will. It doesn't really have anything to do with what we're talking about. I just want to mention Rush. That's the association. But if you listen to the song, they're going through all these questions, and you can tell they're almost turning their brains into pretzels while they're trying to sing this song about free will and what it means. So this is what we're going to zero in on tonight. And some of the big questions around free will is, so one, why doesn't everybody, if everybody can, why doesn't everybody choose Christ?
That's a good question.
Yeah, and why are many people going to hell? Why don't people choose God? And here's the real hard question that we got to struggle through is, can people choose God? Those who don't, can they? Now, I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to go out to the edges tonight. I mean, we're really going out to the edges, I think, of what can be known about what we're going to be talking about. Because you'll hit a place where God says, stop there. And we want to go out to that place, but then we don't want to go beyond that place. Does that make sense? So, free will. Do we really have one? So, let me throw the question out. We're just talking amongst ourselves. I guarantee we're fellow strugglers tonight on this topic. But how would you define free will? How would you define it?
The choice to choose or not to choose.
The choice to choose or not to choose. Okay?
Just the fact that you can make choices.
The fact that you can make choices.
You're not a robot.
Okay? So, meaning that you can choose to do anything you want to do, period, in the story. And that goes for everybody.
That's what you think.
Okay? That's what you think, but is it true?
No, I can't
Because
fly.
there's
I want to
devils,
fly.
yeah.
Okay?
Right,
Interesting.
No, I can't.
right.
So you've got there's constraints there, right? There's some constraints on what we can and can't do. Some things we can't choose.
Right.
Okay? Any other thoughts on that?
And there's,
We're born in sin. We can't choose to not be born in sin. We can't choose to have. I can't choose the color of my eyes.
Okay? So there's things we can't choose, right? All right, yeah.
and there's certain boundaries built into the human mechanism and into the universe that provides boundaries.
So, like, well, I think that's going back, like I'm born where I'm born,
Right.
and we live in a finite place. You mean?
And I can't choose what color I am.
Okay, again, we're back to, yeah, certain things that we don't have
Choose
control over.
appearance.
Okay? So it sounds like you're saying we don't have a free will.
Within boundaries,
We do, but
within.
we're limited.
It depends.
I don't think being able to choose where you're born or what color you are variables that can be considered to determine whether you do or don't have free will. Free will is the things you can choose to do or not to do are what to be considered.
It sounds like nobody's saying, for example, that we are pre-programmed such that we are just going to choose whatever we're pre-programmed to do.
I think I just have enough free will to get cheap grace.
Enough free will to get cheap grace.
Enough free will to get in trouble.
What's that?
Enough free will to get in trouble.
Okay. So,
I'm thinking about, I know it's just a matter of words, but I think, as was brought out, I think that there's an area of free will which has to do with choices that we make.
okay.
And so Joshua says in his parting shot, choose this day whom you will serve.
The Bible certainly, I mean, there's a lot of places, like, you know, and even what your new wallpaper, Dennis, on your phone, right? Mary's chosen the right thing. Choose this day whom you're going to serve, the gods of Baal or God, you know, lots of choices. Good. Okay.
So I think that would keep me from saying before God, before others, I had no choice.
Okay. Because because everybody who doesn't choose Christ is held 100% responsible for that decision, aren't they? Okay. And yet we're born with a condition, aren't we? What's the condition we're born with? Yeah, sin nature, original sin. All right, let's keep moving. We defined it in a way. But there's three positions we're going to focus on. And philosophically, these have been the three positions that have been held historically for centuries, you know, going back to Augustine, 4th century AD, on this subject of free will. So there's primarily three. One's called fatalism, compatibilism, and then libertarianism. So we're going to focus on these three, and you know, maybe you'll come up with a new one. If you come up with a new one, we'll name it after you. But we're going to focus. These are the ones that have been struggled with through history.
Got it. And an ISM though.
It's got to be a Gary. We'll call it Garyism or Copsetism. Or you can name it after your wife. Do it that way too. Okay, so let's define these three. The first one's fatalism. Belief that a person's life and choices are totally and unalterably the result of an endless series of cause and effect. Now, this is like roboticism. This is like you're just doing what you were programmed to do, and that's it. That you don't have any choice at all. Okay? That it's just fatalistic. And you may think you're choosing, but you're essentially a robot. And that one's it's pretty fatalistic, hence the name fatalism. The second one is compatibilism. Belief that a person's actions are free and are determined by his or her own character and desires. So again, we're calling it free will, but to read that, so your actions are free, however, you're going to choose according to your own internal desires. Now, it'll be free, but in a sense, you have things about you that are causing you to make the decisions that you make. They're still your decisions. But just off the top of your head, what are some of the things that cause you to make the decisions that you make? We talked about some of your parents, right? Your influence, right? Consequences. What else?
Your environment.
Environment. Like geographically where you were born. Wyomingites make choices perhaps differently than somebody that lives in Zimbabwe, right? What else?
Your
Your personality.
also your financial status,
Your-
your economic
Your
status.
socioeconomic status.
Wife, fear.
She's shaking her head yes.
I'm just saying, some guys have that.
Yep. Do it in concert with someone else. But who you marry It's got it's a big impact. Why you married? Good. So it's like, okay, so you're kind of free, but then again, you're kind of also heavily influenced just by who you are, your makeup.
Yeah, you got almost a contradiction, are free but are determined.
Yeah, it's like, and again, we're asking, is there like even free will, right? Because we got to keep that in the back of our mind while we're talking about this. So that's compatibilism. It's our genetics, our environment, and sometimes maybe you're just afraid of certain consequences that you've seen happen, your experiences. You only touch the hot stove once. And then there's this last one, libertarianism. Belief that a person's actions are uncaused by any coercion whatsoever. And it's also called indeterminalism. The agent is the first cause of the effect of his or her action. So for example, you're at McDonald's, they give you too much change, you're starting to drive off, and you look down and say, oh, they gave me too much change. So that's the moral dilemma, okay? That's the agent. And according to this view, any other experience, nothing will impact the decision you're about to make in that moment.
So you don't have a conscience, they say?
It's like you don't have a conscience.
And
There's a lot of
everything you
people
choose
like
is
that.
totally arbitrary.
It's totally, and
Arbitrary.
yes, we're kind of jumping to the end, but yeah, that's sort of the conclusion. We can go home now, Dennis. We just, yeah, I mean, in a sense, you're right, because it's like, we talked about the scales. It's like the scales are totally even. They're not tipped one way or another, and every decision you come to, you're coming to with a set of even scales.
That's part.
So you can, now there's a reason for it. You could choose to go back to the window and give them their money back, or you could not choose to go back to the window, but you're not coerced in any way by anything else other than the fact that you were just now presented by that moral dilemma. That's the agency. Now,
But if you have no morals, how is it a moral decision?
so
Good thinking.
I don't think they're going to I'm going to try to put my libertarian hat on and answer and defend it a bit. I don't think they would say that the Holy Spirit isn't working. Like in the case of the believer, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. Okay, let's just take it for what it says right now. That's the basic libertarian view, okay? Okay.
Can I ask something? Question?
Yes, go ahead.
Where do you fit determinism in fatalism? Because I don't know that determinism includes an endless series of cause and effect. How do you see, or is that something else?
It's going to be actually that'll be kind of more the compatibilist position, what you're describing. Yeah, that'll be in the middle of you have the arc. Are you looking at the arc right there?
I haven't turned it yet.
Okay, yeah, look at you. You're coming up with the right questions there. You go, man. Okay, so these are the three positions that this is going to provide the lens that we're going to look at free will through. So, on the spectrum of freedom, this is on the next page of your notes. So, what I want you to look at is on that bottom arrow, the further you go left, the less responsible you are, right? If you're a robot, do you hold a robot responsible for the decisions that it makes?
No.
I mean, frankly, the robot's going to be as good as the maker, right?
Right.
So that would be fatalistic. And as you go all the way to the right, you're 100% responsible, period, end of story. Doesn't matter what home you came from, doesn't matter how your parents treated you, doesn't matter, none of that matters. That's completely immaterial. So therefore, you're held 100% responsible regardless. And in the middle is this mixture. That's the compatibilism that, you can make decisions, however, your decisions are made under the influence of your experiences, who you are, all those things. So Augustine, he said we're born with a depraved nature and we choose according to it. How can we be judged for something that we were predisposed to do? Now this unfairness, we talked about this, I think, in the very first night. Is it fair that we're held responsible for that which we did not choose? That's what the libertarians are grappling with. How can we keep the fairness factor there? So, if God's going to hold people responsible for what they do, then they should have 100% responsibility for what they're doing. Does that make sense? I mean, to me, there is something appealing about that. That if God is holding people responsible for what they do, then they should have 100% freedom in what they're choosing to do.
100%.
100%. Is that... We got quiet here. That's a tough one. Listen, like I said, I went to seminary to pay to get the answers to all these questions.
And you got them?
No. I didn't. I didn't get all the answers. And I want my money back. They haven't given my check back yet. They said I got to send back my diploma if they're...
How can you make good decisions if you don't have any experience?
Yeah, that's it.
Now we're having some... Now, that's a great question. And I think you're raising a good point. How can you make a good decision? Should you be held... Let me back up. Should a child who was born on the streets of Cambodia be held to the same degree of responsibility as somebody who was raised in a loving Christian home with two parents?
No, or Chicago.
Or Chicago.
But that's where God's love and all his characteristics of who he is comes in. You're only going to be accountable for what you're responsible for.
Okay, let's keep going. So does it feel, on a day-to-day basis, does it feel like we're totally free to make the decisions that we make?
Absolutely.
I mean, like leaving here tonight, I can decide if I'm going to go get a milkshake at McDonald's. I can decide if I'm going to go by Thurman or go down Main Street. I can decide. I mean, in our experience, it sure feels that way, doesn't it? So we have to talk about, but then when you start thinking about what Scripture brings into the equation, right? Because are there forces out there working on you to try to make you decide to make bad decisions?
Right.
I mean, when you start thinking about satanic and demonic forces and influences, well, now all of a sudden, according to the Scriptures, I mean, I can't see them, but they're working on me.
But you still have the ability to choose whether or not to give in to whatever temptation Satan is presenting.
So you're kind of sounding like a compatibilist, or maybe even libertarian.
If I only have those three,
Yes?
yeah, I'm a compatibilist.
You'd be a good Augustinian, you know. So, with the libertarianism, the problem with the ends is if you're not, I'm not even going to go there yet. We're just going to wait on that. If we were fatalistic, we couldn't have a court system, right? There'd be nothing to judge. It wouldn't be there. So we're talking about then middle or some of both or some programming and some decisions. So if we're going to break this down, there's nothing, if naturalism is unchristian, there's really no God involved in naturalism. So now not all naturalists would label themselves as fatalists, but fatalism seems to be the only logical conclusion of naturalism. That you came up out of the swamp, you're just doing what more evolved gorilla would do. That's what you're doing. And then the other would be theistic in their basis. And you can see then who would comply with either of those positions. So compatibilism would be Augustine, would be Anselm. Those are some of the early church fathers. And then the reformers. The libertarian view would be, we've covered Pelagius, we've covered Arminius, and then John Wesley as well. He wrote his brother wrote some good songs.
Yeah.
So, with the Arminians, with the Wesleyans, they would say, we are the first cause, or else we couldn't be held responsible. I mean, I kind of get that. Like, I kind of get this idea that they hold a high degree of freedom so that man, and the point is they want man to be held 100% responsible for the decisions that he makes. Like that's why they're taking this position. And it gets God off the hook for judging people for something they aren't responsible for. That would be the way they see it. Well, we're not
Like we
putting,
have to help God out.
well, not that they're helping God out, but that they're trying to get the fair factor in there. Like, if we're going to make this fair, then we have to be responsible for the decisions
But
we're making.
where did the whole idea of fair come from in the first place?
Yeah.
And I think when it comes to God, God is, and what he does is.
But yet it doesn't make sense to us, you know,
Yeah,
our idea of
we
fair.
get ideas of fair, but I don't think when it comes to God, fair's the issue.
So, I don't disagree. I'm playing, I've got my libertarian hat on. I'm wearing my libertarian hat. So if your neighbor breaks the law, if your neighbor gets a speeding ticket, should the police come to your house and give you the ticket for it? Would you say that's fair?
No.
Okay, so that's what they're saying. Well, Adam was the one that did it. I didn't have a chance in this. Why am I being held responsible for something Adam did, not me?
Okay.
You know? That's where they're coming from.
Yeah, but God made that choice.
Yeah.
His universe. He gets
Right,
to make
right.
all the
See,
Yeah,
Well, we were
they
just talking
want
about
us to
that
be
earlier.
like God and make those decisions, and that's the original sentence. We want to be like God and decide what's fair and what's not.
You always sound like a bunch of Baptists.
I love this conversation and I hope it goes on, but talking about it is a moot point. God said,
Yeah, right.
period. So what's to discuss? If
Well,
you
yeah,
think
we're on
about it,
session 8
what's the point?
of the theology program called Free Will. And we want to understand it more deeply than we did when we first came in the door. We want to struggle, man. There are things in the Bible that we have to struggle through and hold in tension.
As long as it don't cost me nothing, carry on.
It's free. How much you pay to get in here, okay? I mean, we got coffee, you know, lights are on, it's warm.
Musical choice.
You got your music in, got to listen to Michael Bublé. So the libertarians are trying to optimize freedom so God can judge fairly. Okay, that's the heart behind it. And then when you look at the compatibilist view, it's like, well, people are born sinners and condemned. Okay, we talked about this last time. We believe they're born sinners, are condemned, and from birth we're fleshly, and yet we are still held 100% responsible for the decisions that we make. And God takes all things into consideration, you know, on that day when we're judged in the sense of rewards. God's going to take everything into consideration. Would He expect as much? What did God say? To whom much is given, much is expected, right? So they're going to say, well, no, God's not going to hold that child born in wherever with no parents, orphan, grew up on the streets, to the same degree He's going to hold someone who grew up in a loving Christian home. Yeah, there's just, He's going to judge. He's the only righteous judge, right? He's the only one that could truly take everything into consideration on Judgment Day.
Right.
So God knows it all, and He takes it all in. He takes that in when He's looking at how you made your decisions. Well, what did you know when you made that decision? What were you capable of? So when people, among these positions that I think we were talking about, among these three positions, when we talk about free will, which one of these three do you think people are probably thinking of?
The libertarian.
The libertarian, yeah. That every decision you make is totally free and unencumbered in any way. I mean, that's what I usually, when Rush sings Free Will, that's what they're singing about. A completely unencumbered decision.
There's never a decision that's completely unencumbered.
You would have to be living in a bubble, just you and your little.
Yeah, right.
You know?
But then we're back to the fair part, which Marcus doesn't want to talk about.
Oh, I do. What's the point? What's the God said?
We're struck. The point is the struggle, my man. It's the struggle.
Just this couple days ago, we heard someone say, you know, you talk fair, that's where they show pigs sell cotton candy. I mean, you know,
That's
there's
fair.
just really no other.
Life's not fair.
Right.
So where does the nature versus nurture fall? You know, for certain you know, it's not even not even a discussion anymore, but when I was young, it was the whole, that homosexuality is a sin. Well, now, of course, it's legal and, you know,
Right.
marriage is between a man and a man is legal and all of that. So there's not so much of that discussion, but I'm wondering, you know, where that falls. And-
Yeah, so that would fall in that that middle view, the compatibilist view, because they're going to take into account, you know, it's one or the other, right? You can argue nature, you can argue nurture. In essence, they're going to say something is influencing the decisions that you're making. Whether it's nature or whether it's nurture, one of those is still governing decisions. So, now, you know, I think the homosexual argument would be, if it's DNA, then that kind of removes responsibility. Now, I mean, from a sociological standpoint, I think that's more arguing that we're due the same rights based on race or based on gender or something.
Well,
Those
now
lines.
gender is where it, you know,
Where you
everything's
wanna
focused on
choose it.
gender now.
Yeah.
And what's it in? I'm talking to the youth about this Wednesday. You know, we're going to tackle some pretty tough questions like, well, can a Christian be gay? And one of the big questions with our youth is, how do I treat friends who tell me they're gay? What am I supposed to do? Which is a really, can you imagine being a teenager right now in the world that they're having to grow up in, that they're having to navigate? It's an identity question. It's like, when people say, who am I? They're trying to figure that out. If they can make it a gender issue, if they can make it a sexual orientation issue, we're looking for an identity. Every unbeliever is looking for an identity. Now, I'll say every unbeliever has a false identity. Every Christian's struggling with a false identity. A good question. But yeah, nature, nurture, both are going to be in that compatibilist.
And if you think about it, it's the biggest slam on God that you can proclaim, because you're saying you've made a mistake.
Yeah.
It's God.
Well,
Or who's the
and I think
Or
it's
we're God.
whether it's DNA or it doesn't matter. Like he said, live this way and struggle against the desire to not live this way. Whatever put the desire there is what put the desire there. You know, if I say, what's my DNA that I'm, you know, attracted to women to whom I'm not married? Well, what's that got to do with it, right? One wife, one man, one woman.
Or
Some relationships are
It
forbidden.
could be a result of the fall, and yet another result of the fall.
Yeah.
Well,
And again, you're back to that compatibilist view that, you know, there's certain things in you that's going to compel you to act a certain way. Yeah, good. We'll revisit this as we go through some scriptures on this too. So we'll come back around to this a bit as well. Okay, so, and this is an illustration that Aristotle would use. He would say, this is to illustrate these three positions, that if a man hits a rock with a stick, and here he's holding a stick, he hits, I know there's some balls on the screen, but imagine the rocks.
Pool stick.
I know. Okay, a man hits a pool ball with a pool stick. The ball was moved by the stick, which was moved by the man. Are the stick and the rock to be blamed for the action of the ball? Was it the stick that moved the ball?
It was the ball. that
Or was it the man that moved the ball? Or was it the arm connected to the stick that moved the ball?
Really?
So he would say the man is to blame since he was the first cause of the event. So he would say it's the man and there's no prior cause and effect. It was just the man. Well, here's the thing. What if you had parents who loved rocks? What if you had a prior experience of hitting a rock and it blew up or didn't blow up? Or, in other words, what prior experiences may have moved the man? Do you see where this is going? So, the man would be the libertarian in that instance because he just hit the rock. But the compatibilist and the fatalist would say, well, what caused him to hit the rock? He didn't just hit for no reason. Okay, moving on. The compatibilist, and if you look down through this flow chart, when it comes to decision making, well, first, he's got a nature, and we would, as Christians, would say, yeah, well, man is born with a sinful nature, and that's going to cause him to make decisions a certain way. But it's not going to be his nature, it's also going to be the outside influences, where he was born, the kind of family he was born into, the decisions he saw that were modeled for him. And that's going to impact his values, the nature and the family, those are going to develop into values. And his personality, the values determine the personality, your passions, your desires. Why do you do what you do, Some in this room love working with wood. Some love biology. And we've got ladies here who like different things as well. We've got librarians. We've got some nurses. We've got ranchers, right? We do what we do. We've got individual personalities, and we've got outside influences, like what kind of, the job we have, the who we've married, and that'll all impact whether we make right and wrong decisions. All of that. Now, the libertarian, and the outside influences, I've heard, people start. You ever heard that people start to look alike when they've been married for a while? I know there's some ladies. Don't panic. I don't mean in any, not in a physical way. That you just start acting more and more like each other. You start making decisions more alike the longer you've been married. There's some things you probably will never see eye to eye on, which is good too. Nothing wrong with that. But then a lot of things you see eye to eye on that maybe you didn't before. And then I've got another example. Prior to having the child that I had, I really didn't know that ADHD existed. I was just kind of like, I was raised that, well, that's just parents that don't spank enough. That's what ADHD is. Well, I've learned that no, it's a real thing. And you're not going to just paddle this out of a kid. And it's taken me years to get to the place where I'm willing to look at it in a different way. But that's one of those outside influences through an experience that your view changes on something. So in the compatibilist view, the scales are tipped and you'll choose according to your greatest desire every time. If you think about those scales and why you choose good or evil, it's according to your desires every time. Now the libertarian view, it's right there. You start at the very beginning, you start with a choice. And notice where the choice happens before any of those other influences come into play. In other words, nothing is impacting the choice that you're making. And if you don't choose right, everything else will follow. And you choose wrong, and will follow the wrong path.
Wait.
Yes?
Who's determining what's right and what's wrong?
Well, you are.
It's right if that's what you want to do. And taken to a far extreme, if you don't believe in God, if you make yourself to be God and able to choose what you want to do is right.
I was living with her.
I think you're making a great point. Yeah. I think you're hitting the nail on the head, but I don't want to jump to that just yet.
Okay.
We'll still wear the libertarian hat. And your very first choice determines your entire life. Now, is it true that the choices you make impact how your life turns out?
Oh, yeah.
So there is some truth in this idea that you're going to make choices and things are going to turn out according to those choices. Practically, that makes sense. So we see it play out, but every choice has to be perfectly balanced because every choice is made without the impact of any of these other items in our life, not our personality or our values or outside influence. In every choice, the balances are not tipped in one way or another.
That's the
Who
libertarian.
controls
That's the
that?
libertarian view.
Which is just not realistic.
Who controls them?
So it's like God would have to come in each time and balance the scales. By the way, what is it that balances the scales? I'm jumping ahead, but hey, we're already there. You guys you're so sharp, you're getting right to it. What is it that balances the scales in the libertarian view? What would be the argument of the Arminian or the Wesleyan? Remember that?
Oh,
Magic dust,
Oh, yeah, which symbolizes what?
grace. No.
Yes, what kind of grace?
Sprinkled grace.
You're close. Prevenient. Yeah,
Free what?
yeah, prevenient grace is what allows the scales to become even again. That God gives grace for people to make decisions not based on any prior experiences or anything. That's how people can choose God when they have original sin. There's got to be some kind of grace applied. That's prevenient grace.
What's that word mean again?
You could call it choosing grace.
Choosing grace.
That's something that you had a great word for it last time. You can call it free will grace because it's that grace that allows you to have free will. Enabling grace. Oh, that was good.
Enabling.
That's good Dennisism right there.
Enabling.
Enabling grace. Yeah, good. So, okay, does this make sense right here?
No.
So you on the libertarian side, you make the right choice, and you go through the nature, values, personality, outside influences. Then you have a choice again.
Yeah.
Right.
Can you bounce back to the wrong?
Yeah, because you're set. The scales are set again. And it you can, on the compatibilist view, you all those things are connected to every choice you make. In the libertarian view, you choose right and wrong, and then you experience all these other items, and then you have another choice.
And it doesn't relate at all to the last choice.
Correct. Otherwise, the scales would be tipped.
Meanwhile, in an alternate universe,
Moving along.
Be true.
So, the compatibilist view, you've got the natural man. So, Romans 9:18 through 21. You've got a person, and look at how the scales are tipped. Where are they tipped? Can you read that little word?
Evil.
They're tipped to evil. Okay, this is the natural man. This is the man who does not know Christ. Romans 9:18 through 21. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? You see what Paul's saying there? Paul is raising the issue. Well, how is it you can find someone guilty if they don't have the ability to choose anything other than from their own sinful nature? He knows the question. That's what's so fascinating about it. Paul knows the question that we're going to be asking of God. Okay? So then what? What does he say? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? So God doesn't change the nature here. He determines their boundaries and what we can't control. He's still in control of the unbeliever. It's not like, because you see, God determines, Acts 17:26, what the outside influences are, like where you're going to be born, to whom you're going to be born. You didn't have a choice in any of those things. We covered all that. All the things we don't have control over. God decided these things, and then he influences someone's values. He influences personality. He influences all the outside influences. What's going to be around that person? If he chose for you to be born in a particular time period, you wouldn't have had the experience of electricity. He controls these things. So, then, what about the regenerate man? Okay? God's going to tip the scales through regeneration. Ephesians 2:5. Even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. So now, look at where God has sovereignly tipped the scales. He's tipped them to the good. And Now we're predisposed to do good. Acts 17:26. He's still, but everything else is the same. Do you see that? Only now he has predisposed you and given you the ability to make a good choice. Okay, any questions about this?
So did you use free will to get to the regenerate man then? Is that in this compatibilist view? Because it wasn't the free will then, under this view, to get to be in regenerate?
What do you mean by free will?
Well, how do you get to be regenerate? If, under the system.
So, because it doesn't feel fair, does it?
Oh, I don't know.
That's what the Arminians and the Wesleyans are dealing with, is this exact point. Well, wait a minute. Where do we choose? How can we choose if we have original sin, if we're already tainted? See, this is the challenge. Like, there's a tension here that I can't, the seminary, even though I paid them to do it, did not explain away. And that's what makes this, when we start talking free will, and what is it, or if it even exists, this is the challenge, this is the hard thing that we start hitting up against, because is God totally sovereign if my will is totally free? You see the issue there?
Yeah.
The problem of the imputation of sin, the problem of being born with a sin nature. There's answers here that help me that we'll get to, but this is the struggle, I believe, is exactly what you're bringing up. When do we choose? When does God, because the Arminian and the Wesley, that's what they call prevenient grace. That's what's appealing about prevenient grace, is God gave you the grace to choose. That's why we label it enabling or choosing grace, is because that's what God threw out there to give people that ability to overcome that sin nature, that original sin, to be able to make a free choice. Does that make sense?
Right, and from our viewpoint, even if you don't believe in this kind of theology, I think always from our viewpoint, and when you talk to people, you're assuming that too.
I'll always share the gospel like a libertarian.
Right.
Every single time.
Always. Otherwise, you wouldn't be out there talking to anybody.
You got it. Well,
And that's why-
there are people that take that position. Well, God's going to save who's God. I've known people who rejected the gospel because they said, "No, Chad, you don't." I was working at Mount Storm Power Station, talking to my buddy Guppy, and I tried to share the gospel with Guppy, and he said, "Just stop it." Why? Well, because it's already set. I said, "What do you mean it's already set? It's already predetermined if I'm going to accept this or not."
Who said it?
He said all of that. Yeah, he was telling me, stop sharing the gospel with me, it doesn't matter. It's already predetermined who's going to trust Jesus and who's not, so
Huh?
On what basis was he saying that it's already
Was his-
I'm
Right.
supposing someone told him
It was a guppyism.
it was a guppyism. There are, there are strands of, hyper-Calvinism is the technical name that doesn't believe in evangelism because everything is just set. However, would anybody read the Bible and walk away thinking that? No. No, I don't think anybody would.
The Dutch Reformed.
Why would Jesus send his disciples out to die sharing the gospel with everybody if it was pointless? But let's keep going. We're getting to the crux of the issue here. Like, we're getting to this issue of, well, wait a second. Everybody should be able to free to choose, but hold on. How is it all of a sudden become free to be able to choose? That's the issue. I mean, and we'll cover this. This is a plug for the spring, January. We're going to go through soteriology, and we're kind of getting it. So soteriology is a study of salvation. We're kind of brushing up against it right now. So come back and we'll talk about it more. We're going to cover it a little bit more tonight. Yes.
But there's whole denominations like Dutch Reformed do not believe in evangelism.
Right. That's hyper
at all.
Calvinism.
In
Yeah.
fact, I had a girl was on crusade staff with me, and she was raised Dutch Reformed, and when she went to college and really trusted the Lord and learned, and she chose to go on crusade staff, the church that she'd been raised in and all her relatives were in, kicked her out.
Wow.
That they were that strong on that point.
That would be hard. Mm.
Yeah.
So then, from a libertarian perspective, again, they're acknowledging, look at how the scales are initially tipped. They're tipped evil. Okay, they're saying man has a predisposition to evil. So what happens? We need the pixie dust. We need the prevenient grace. We need to be enabled to choose. And it's through that grace that God evens the scales, and then people choose. They accept or they reject. And then if they accept Christ, they, in a regenerate way, through the power, now they've got the working of the Holy Spirit on their nature, values, personality, or they reject, and all of that is just, it continues to be a slave to sin, slave to evil. Does that make sense? Okay.
So, pardon me, if they go to the reject Christ and they go down that value stream,
Yeah.
they make another decision, that yes or no.
So
what is that decision at that point?
Well, there could be another opportunity for the application of prevenient grace, but in essence,
They could keep going down the rabbit hole and no.
they could. Yeah, it's a good question.
And if they start off on the left accepts Christ, they're always going to go yes at the end, because if they accept at the beginning, they can't make any other decision.
So,
I thought that's
No.
just at the bottom, isn't that just our millions of decisions that we make?
yeah, that's the continued, there's always another decision,
Well,
always
that's
another
not a
decision.
salvation decision.
No.
Don't they believe you can lose salvation?
Yes.
So, if they could go down and start that pathway, but they won't always say yes. They could say no and go to a lost salvation.
Well, that's true. Yeah, you could,
And then how you do that is a huge argument too.
how you decide to not believe anymore. Yeah. Because if you can decide to believe, then you can decide not to believe. It's that, and we'll talk about that more in soteriology, but the means by which you are kept saved is the means by which you were saved. In other words, who's keeping you saved? Is it your decisions keeping you saved, or is it God that's keeping you saved? Does that make sense?
I like the unchanging one better than the one that
I
can
vote
change.
for God.
Yeah. It's God doing the saving,
Yes.
keeping you saved. All right, so when you start looking at the problem, what are some problems with compatibilism? Well, one, it's difficult to see how a person's acts can be both free and determined, right? That's what you brought up at the very beginning, right? There's a conundrum you get into there. It's that question, was there truly free will if the acts if what we choose is in some way determined by who we are, personality, nature, nurture, all those things? And then second, why would God still find fault in man if he is the first cause that placed him in the circumstances that have determined his choices? I don't really have an answer to that. I paid lots of money to a seminary, and we're getting to the edge. When I say we're getting to the edge of what can be known, and you can go back, what did Paul say to the people asking the question? Oh man, who are you to talk to the potter that way? You can go back to the end of Job. What did Job arrive at? When Job was coming at God.
I've seen you and I've got no more questions.
Yeah, I've seen you and I've got no more questions.
Does Isaiah not talk about that?
Could. Yeah.
About my thoughts are higher than your thoughts.
Oh yeah. Your ways are above my way. Yeah. Yeah.
And then the end of chapter
Mystery of
11
the
of
faith.
Romans, that whole crescendo, all the depths of the riches, with the whole mystery, after he has gone into exposition, he's almost saying, I've done the best I can.
That's exactly right. Yeah, you hit the point, and you don't. There's this. Oh, what was the phrase? It's good to hold on to the doctrine of suspended judgment when we start talking about this. At some point, it's important. I can live in this tension, and I remember the first time I heard of Calvinism when I was a kid. It rocked me. It rocked me because it seemed like it was taking choice away from people. And it took years. I was disturbed by this, and it's still. I'm not willing to say. I'm and we'll talk about what 5-point Calvinism is. I'm not willing to go down the road and say, well, I am a 5-point Calvinist and dogmatically stand on that. I'm not willing to do that. We want to stay biblical. We want to hold things in tension when Scripture holds things in tension.
Well, the whole thing is just admitting you're not God.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to, don't you?
It is. I mean, I think that's even, so you go to Job, and so Job is like, he's like, who are you, God? Why am I going through this? And what does God do? Well, he shows up in a storm. And, Job has these questions for God. Why have you done what you've done? And what does he say, 38? Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? God is saying you don't and can't know enough in order to understand the answers to these questions. Yeah. And you get 42, Job replied, I know that you can do all things. No plan of yours can be thwarted. So, and God knows we'll have this dilemma, and Paul's addressing it. Paul says, suspend judgment. Don't answer back to God and say, who are you? Even at the end of the book of John, I was reading it today, in John 21, and Peter's questioning God. Well, why? Peter's told, I'm going to have to evidently be carried somewhere I don't want to be carried. And he's like, well, what about John? And what does God say? What's it to you if I choose for John to stay here until I come back and you don't get that? What's it to you? That's a really nice way of saying, Peter, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about.
None of your business.
Again, none of your business.
And there was another, who was it that was hoping that God would destroy Nineveh?
Yeah, Jonah's like, God, smite those Ninevites.
And he was pouting when God withered the tree that he was under, the plant that he was under.
Yeah. And you're just left at the end of the book, really, with attention. He doesn't really answer Jonah. It's like, Jonah, do you see what I just did through you? You will go down as the greatest evangelist in the Bible. And you did the poorest evangelism of anybody in the history of the Bible.
And he was kicking all the way.
He's kicking all the way.
Pouting after the.
With no promise that the Ninevites are even going to be saved. He just says, God's going to destroy your city. That's it. Yeah. See ya.
That's the end of the message.
And I'm going to sit down and I'm going to watch it all happen. He waits and it doesn't happen. So problems with libertarianism, you're very astute, I'd have to say. You all have been getting at these along the way already. As nice as it sounds, the Bible never teaches explicitly or implicitly the idea of prevenient grace. It's a derived necessity logically from this position. People have to have free will. They have to be able to choose. They can't choose because they're bound by sin. They got to be free from sin to choose. So, we'll call it prevenient grace. And I like the idea of it. It's just not there. Number two, if a person's will is not affected either by predisposition or outside influence, then it is completely arbitrary. Arbitrary choices are not truly free. In other words, not even you can make the decision. See, that's the problem with libertarianism. You can't even make the decision. I mean, how is the decision even made? If it's totally and completely arbitrary, there's no such thing. Liz, you were getting at that? You got that like right out of the chute, you got that. It's like you'll be sitting at McDonald's forever deciding whether or not you're going to go back to take the money back to the cashier. And they go, you're just going to sit there. So libertarian free will, again, it's 50-50. That is that a choice is never made. There's no persuading factors that affect the choice one way or another. There's a perfect state of balance in the mind. The person's confined to a perpetual state of indecisiveness. That's the problem. 3, the Bible does teach that people's choices are affected by other people's choices. So Deuteronomy 25, you shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me. So the idea is that the decisions of the father are going to affect the kids clear out to the third and the fourth generations. Mark 9:42, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe to stumble, it would be better for him if with a heavy millstone, that I say that it would be better for him if with a heavy millstone hung around his neck, he'd been cast into the sea. So again, it's like God's going to hold you responsible for negatively influencing children, negatively influencing kids, influencing choices against Christ. So according to free will, this little review, Pelagianism. By the way, what color do you see when you think Pelagius? Orange. Why do you see orange? There's two reasons.
Council of Orange?
The Council of Orange, where it was deemed heretical. And what else about orange?
Somebody named Orange, wasn't it?
So this one's a little bit tougher. No offense, I love Home Depot. No offense on Home Depot. But like, when you come to a project, Home Depot wants you to see orange. You know, you're going to do it yourself. That's the Pelagian idea that you can do it yourself. Like if you need grace, you can go down to Home Depot and buy a little grace if you need grace. But if you don't need grace, if you don't sin, you don't need grace, and there's a possibility that you won't sin. That's Pelagian free will, see? That for the unfallen person, that would be Adam and Eve, right? They were the only unfallen beings. They could choose evil or good. But if somebody is fallen, like us, you or me, we can still choose evil or good. The redeemed person, the Christian, they can still choose to do evil or choose to do good. Only the glorified person can't do evil. Only the person who has died and been resurrected cannot make an evil choice. They can only choose good. Otherwise, everything is equal opportunity. Arminian free will. The unfallen person, Adam, could choose evil or good. The fallen person is a little different. They can choose evil. Then they can choose evil or good, just depending on whether or not prevenient grace has come on them. If the prevenient grace has come, they can choose to do good. If it hasn't, they can only choose to do evil. The redeemed person can choose evil or good. Again, the glorified person can only choose good. Augustinian free will. This is compatibilism. It would be the unfallen Adam in the garden. He could choose evil or good. He's able not to sin. Those Latin phrases, that's the translation. He was able not to sin. The fallen person, the unredeemed sinner, is not able not to sin. They can only make an evil choice. The Christian is able not to sin, can choose good, and the glorified person cannot choose evil. They can only choose good. So, this is, we were talking, you said this earlier, I'm telling you, it's just like you read the notes. You know, we may choose to fly, but we can't fly, right? The fallen person, for them to choose to do good would be like someone choosing to fly. Well, they can't. So they can't choose that. It's not a viable choice. So is there such a thing as free will? We've got a few more minutes here. This is like, so again, did everybody get one of these articles called Is It Fair That You Were Born with a Sin Nature? Okay. So I want to refer to that in just a second. Do we have free will? Yes and no. No, if you mean that we have libertarian freedom or freedom to choose against our nature, what Augustine defined as liberty. Yes, if you mean that we will always be free to choose according to our greatest desire, but we are bound by the inclinations of our nature to such a degree that we would never choose against it. In other words, an unredeemed Christian will always choose according to their desires, and it will never be the righteous desire. So summary, man's will is free in the sense that he's free to do what he's able to do. In other words, man's free will is limited by his ability. Man has the natural ability to make choices, but lacks the ability to make godly choices. And man cannot make any move toward God on his own, since his will is in bondage and an enmity against God in its natural state. So, all through the book of John, you see both ideas. Jesus says, whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. He also says, only those who my Father has chosen will come to me. John 3:16, whosoever, right? Whosoever believes. So you've got both in the book of John. And I love the way, Keller says this often, you are 100% responsible if you don't choose God. And God is 100% sovereign in that if you do choose God, it was only because He made you able to do it. And those are both true. And if you get away from that, you're going to fall into one of these wrong places. So, John 6:44, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. 34 through 36 of John 8, Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The Son does remain forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. So the idea is you're in bondage to sin until you're made free. Until then, you don't have the will or the ability to make a decision to not sin. Romans 8:16 to 23, and this is, I'm going just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the whole passage. You can read it, but it's the similar idea of being in bondage. Luke 6:45, the good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil, for his mouth speaks from that which fills his heart. Again, and only God can change the heart. How can we be held guilty for the sin of another? Is it fair and righteous to have the sin of another counted against us and have our nature corrupt to such a degree that all of our inclinations are toward evil? Isn't original sin unjust? So this is an answer from Pascal, and then we'll look at, I want to end with something in this handout. Without doubt, nothing is more shocking to our reason than to say that the sin of the first man is implicated in its guilt. Men so far from the original sin that they seem incapable of sharing it. This flow of guilt does not seem merely impossible to us, but indeed most unjust. What could be more contrary to the rules of our miserable justice than the eternal damnation of a child incapable of will for an act in which he seems to have so little part that it was actually committed 6,000 years before he existed? Certainly nothing jolts us more rudely than this doctrine. Pascal probably would have been of the libertarian variety. But I think that there's something that rings there for us. So, St. Thomas Aquinas' theory on the redemption of angels. So, Michael Patton, that wrote this curriculum, I was talking before people came in, he wrote a paper on something that helps him through this. He wrote this paper, Is it fair that you were born with a sin nature? And he gets his answer from Aquinas' view of angels. So I want to read this together. On page 3, if we go down to the line that starts St. Thomas Aquinas, do you see that paragraph?
Yes.
So let's go through this. St. Thomas Aquinas was asked, he asked himself in one of his characteristic diatribes, why doesn't God save fallen angels the way he saves humans? His answer may or not be right, but I think it provides a perfect analogy for our current struggle. Aquinas believed that the reason God does not provide salvation for fallen angels because Christ would have to represent each angel individually. In other words, since God can't represent a species called angels, there's no way for him to die for all the species angels at once. He would have to become each individual angel and die countless times. The important thing to notice here is that since the angels were created individually, they also fell from grace individually. Now, what's that mean?
How does
So he may not be right. So keep that in mind too. But he's making the point that he didn't think that there was an imputation of sin. In other words, it wasn't that one sin was committed by Satan, and then every subsequent angel that came after him was guilty by association with Satan. Like they were not in Satan, the way we are in Adam. So if you recall what it says in Romans, as sin came in through the one man, so it what? Yeah. Through one man we are saved. And Aquinas is saying that's why that would not work for the angels. Because sin didn't come in through the one angel. It came in through each individual angel. Does that make sense? Again, this is a theory. I'm not gonna go start a church on this. So, again, whether or not that is correct makes no difference. What is important is that we can see how Christ, who was born physically and spiritually connected to Adam, yet without sin, could die for the entire human race. He could do so because he became the species human and did what Adam could not. He took on our nature in order to be the new representative. This is why Christ is called the second Adam. This is the only reason that one man, Christ Jesus, could hang on the cross, representing all mankind. Christ was human and could therefore take away the human stain all at once. In other words, well, let me keep going. This may not relieve your stress about the issue. You may still say to yourself that we should have all been given our own chance unconnected to Adam. While if such be the case, we may not be able, I think that should say, if such be the case, we may not be able to have Christ as our Savior. Maybe we wouldn't need Him. Maybe we would never sin and fall like Adam. Maybe we could live our entire lives in perfect obedience. In theory, this may be correct. If we could make it our entire lives without sinning, we would not need Christ. If we fell, our condemnation would be understandable. At least we would all get a chance, you might say. This is true. Being born without imputed or inherited sin might give us a better chance. But what if God, who knows all things, saw that every human given their own chance, completely unconnected from Adam and the human race, would fall into the same destruction? What if he knew every single one of us could not make it? What if God knew we would choose against him? What if God saw this situation and graciously connected all humanity both physically and spiritually? What if the inheritance of our sinful nature gives us the only chance of inheriting Christ's righteous nature? I believe this is an immensely reasonable speculation that most of us would probably assume without question. And if this is the case, if God knew we would all fall in the same manner as Adam, then being born with a fallen nature is most definitely an act of God's grace. We now have a second option in our representation as humans. In the end, we will be found in one of two conditions. We will be found, to use biblical languages, in Adam or in Christ. I'm not saying the doctrines I've explained it as gospel. I'm not positive that it's right, but I do think it makes the most sense and alleviates us of the negative emotions we might have toward God for allowing us to have a sin nature from conception. So if that helps, I think it's an interesting answer. I think it's kind of reasonable. It's already come up once in this course. Someone said, well, I think it was you, Peggy, that said, well, God knew that we'd all screw up just like Adam did. Right. And if we want to argue fairness, was it fair that Christ came, who was perfect, took on the sin of the world on himself to provide grace and salvation?
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, what's so fair about that?
That's a little bit more unfair than this imputation of sin. That's a lot more unfair. That makes less sense.
So I hope, did this give you a different perspective on free will? It's not like we think it is. Maybe you already have it figured out. I don't. I will probably go to my grave having it not figured out. And if anybody came to me and said they got it all figured out, I wouldn't believe them. I just don't think that's the case. You made a good comment in our elder meeting. We don't ever want to think we've arrived, right? This discipleship is an ongoing process, and we struggle with scriptures. Any comments or questions about any of this?
Does this stand for something, Tulip?
Oh.
Yes.
Maybe.
So we'll talk about that more.
That's how flowers whistle.
I like that.
If they're
So if
convinced.
someone would say they're that's good. Da-da-da.
Lance likes
If
it.
someone were a 5-point Calvinist, they would hold those 5, each letter stands for a point in 5-point Calvinism. T's, total depravity. What's U? Anybody know? Unconditional election.
Yeah.
L is limited atonement. I is irresistible grace. And P is perseverance of the saints.